This is part 3 of the Gospel according to Agricola. Jesus grows up in Nazareth. This follows on from the first Christmas according to Agricola the donkey, parts 1 and 2, and it is narrated by Agricola the donkey. So Jesus grew in wisdom and strength, and God's favour was upon him. And there was much laughter, and sometimes tears, and there were more children, and more foals. The foals were sold on to new owners, and the children were not. Jesus was a happy lad, observant and kind, quick to see the humour in a situation, and always willing to help someone less fortunate than himself. I heard a story once that another young lad pushed him over in the street, and that Jesus had cursed him with leprosy. Well, that's not the Jesus I know. He was far more likely to get a honey cake from Mary and take it to the lad and make a friend out of him. He would say that the best way to get rid of an enemy was to turn him into a friend. I also heard that he'd made birds out of mud and breathed life into them, and they flew away. Well, I saw Jesus play in the mud many times, and the only thing that flew was Mary flying into a temper when she saw how muddy he'd got. He did have a knack of carving things out of wood, something that Joseph was not able to teach him. Joseph would try and carve a rabbit, and folk would be kind and say, "That's a nice donkey." But give Jesus a bit of wood and a sharp knife, and he could carve a bird, and you would think it could fly away. Jesus was a quick learner. From an early age he could recall and recite scripture after just one hearing, or when he learnt to read, just one reading. You could see him thinking about it and trying to understand what it all meant. There was a rabbi in Nazareth, Ezra the woodcutter. He was a jot of a man, with large, fleshy ears, a beak of a nose, and the voice of a crow. His eyes were like coal, or rather one eye was, because the second was always half closed in a kind of a wink. He had a narrow chin, cleft like a wishbone, filled out by a scraggy goat-like beard. And he was the wisest, humblest, funny, ungodly, godly man I'd ever met. The combination of Jesus' youthful, inquiring mind and Ezra's aged learning and interpretation of his own life experiences was a joy to behold, and they were firm friends by the time Jesus was 5 years old. Ezra once said to Mary, "I think that Jesus of yours was born with a long white beard." And Mary just smiled and said, "You noticed, Rabbi." And she smiled to herself, remembering the more than several beards that Jesus had grasped as a child. A few years later, Jesus must have been 8 or perhaps 10. He came and sat on the wall next to where I was tethered in the shade of an old olive tree, and he cried and cried. I could do little to comfort him, except to nuzzle him and dribble slightly on him, but he didn't notice the dribble, as his tears had already made him rather damp. After a while, Joseph came looking for him, and noticing the state he was in, embraced him in a deep and affectionate fatherly hug, and held him as more floods of tears came and went. Joseph got quite damp too. Eventually, Jesus managed to choke out, They say I'm a bastard child, and that you and Mum are immoral, bad people. Some even say that you are not my father." Some children were chanting it at me again and again, and I didn't know what to do. I was only trying to be kind to Sarah's child Hannah, because I know that her dad died before she was born, and the other children are often unkind to her because of that. You and Mum aren't bad people, are you? What is a bastard child? You are my dad, aren't you? Mary, who had heard some crying but was settling her youngest baby to sleep, came out to see what was happening. She had never seen Jesus in such a state. He was normally a happy, smiling child. She gave him a big motherly hug, which provoked another bout of sobbing from Jesus, resulting in another soggy parent. Joseph repeated to Mary what Jesus had just said, resulting in more tears. I was getting quite concerned that Jesus would get dehydrated. Mary said, "I think he's old enough now to be told about the angels and the shepherds and the wise men and Simeon and Anna, and then he can decide for himself who he thinks his father is." So, together, sitting on the wall in the afternoon shade of our olive tree, Joseph told the story you have already read about, and Jesus listened, and Mary added some bits here and there, and slowly Jesus' broken heart was mended, which is what Joseph was particularly good at, and slowly Jesus began to understand who he was, who his real father was, though he didn't really get to grips with this until he was 12 years old. When Jesus was about 11, there was this guy, Judas the Galilean they called him. He got some guys together and raided the royal armoury at Sepphoris, which is only 4 miles northwest of Nazareth. Sepphoris was the capital city of the area, even sporting a Roman amphitheatre seating 3,000 people. The Romans retaliated with all the brutality of an occupying force. They burnt Sepphoris to the ground, crucified 2,000 of the men, and sold the rest of its inhabitants into slavery. Now 2,000 crosses were a lot of crosses to be made, and to make a point to the local towns around, they recruited the local Jewish carpenters to do the work for them. Initially, they tried to refuse, but the first to do so was cut down outside his workshop, and his house was burnt down with all his family still inside it. I'm ashamed to say the crosses were made, and they were rough because those making them were weeping. And Jesus, who was old enough to help, wept with the rest. He knew what a cross was for. Crucifixion was part of our lives. You know, sometimes the kids would taunt one another when they were trying to be cruel or to frighten one another. They'd say, "They're going to crucify you, they're going to crucify you." It was a beastly, degrading taunt, and it was supposed to hurt, and it did. But you know, I never saw any of the children actually playing "we're going to crucify you" games. There was plenty of fighting games and killing Roman games, but never crucifixion games. Once you have seen one, you would never play about it. The reality of crucifixion was worse than your worst nightmare. Every year, around your Easter time, we would travel as a family up to Jerusalem to join in the Passover festival there. It was a long way to go, over 80 miles, but we would travel together with extended family and friends, and sometimes there would be over 100 of us, and it was quite a party, and the route was well known to us all. We knew where to stop for the night, where to get food as we travelled. Indeed, most of us had friends who lived along the well-travelled route, who enjoyed seeing us year after year. There were 2 main routes to Jerusalem. One, which we usually travelled, took us over the east of the Jordan, through Gentile lands, and down just north of the Dead Sea, then across to Jericho, and up from the east into Jerusalem. The other route took us straight south through Samaria and into Jerusalem from the north. This was not the preferred route, as the Samaritans were heretics, and there was a lot of bad feeling between the Jews and Samaritans, and so generally it was safer to travel through Gentile lands than Samaritan lands. There was another palaver when Jesus was 12 years old and we left him behind in Jerusalem. A Jewish boy is a child until he's 12 years old, and thus he will travel with the women at the front of the caravan. He's a man when he's 13 years old, and thus will travel with the men bringing up the rear of the caravan. When you have over 100 folk in your caravan, and the chaos of hundreds of other similar caravans coming and going around Jerusalem, and when you have a trustworthy young lad like Jesus, it's easy to assume he is with the other parent, or at least he is with his friends, and you will see him when you camp for the night. But no such luck this year. A happy camp for the night, but then no Jesus, and suddenly some very unhappy campers, and no sleep for Mary and Joseph. As soon as it was light enough to travel, we were on the road back to Jerusalem, leaving the other children in the safe hands of relatives and Sarah to help share the load. We arrived back in Jerusalem in the early afternoon. We had travelled back much faster than we had left the day before. Of course, we went to where we had been staying during the Passover. No Jesus. And then there was the market, then friends we knew in Jerusalem, then relatives we had in Jerusalem, and then relatives we didn't know we had in Jerusalem, and then favourite eating places, and other eating places, and then places we would definitely not go to eat places. Still no Jesus. How can you lose the Son of God? Mary was frantic, and even calm, stable Joseph was beginning to look worried by the end of the second day. There was another brief and sleepless night, and then the search began again at dawn. By now it was becoming hard to resist visions of Jesus dead down some dark alley or on a rubbish heap somewhere. So every dark alley was explored, and we even checked out the city rubbish heap outside the city wall. Through the dung gate in the southeast corner of the city and into the valley of Hinnom, sometimes known as Gehenna, where all the city rubbish is dumped and burnt. It's a hellish place of stench and smoke, and often bodies are dumped there to be lost and digested in the filth and garbage. We found a dead donkey, but no Jesus. Finally, exhausted, stinking and filthy, with no other place to go, we went to the temple. And there, in the outer courts, under the arches of Solomon's portico that runs all along one side of the temple courts, there at last we found Jesus. Traditionally, during the Passover time, all the great teachers and thinkers in Jerusalem would gather under these arches and teach and listen and hear questions and answer questions. It was a wonderful time for learning and stretching of the intellect. Teachers and those being taught, and bystanders who went to listen, hoping to be entertained by some wisdom or illustrative story. It is traditional for a young Jewish boy to learn by the way of question and answer, and Jesus and Rabbi Ezra would spend many happy hours back in Nazareth sparring thus. And now here was Jesus sitting at the feet of several of these teachers, quietly asking questions and impressing them with what he was asking and the answers he was giving to their questions. Mary rushed up to him, almost screaming, "Where have you been? Your father and I have been searching everywhere for you." Jesus had never seen his mother so distressed or so filthy from their search. "I have stayed here, safe in my Father's house. I thought this would be the first place you would look when you realized I was not with you." Jesus allowed himself to be scooped up and marched sharply to a quieter part of the temple courts. All of the anxiety and worry Mary had been holding over the last couple of days flooded out of her. "Where have you been? Where did you sleep? What did you eat? What have you washed? Why weren't you in our caravan? We thought you were dead." And then she burst into tears and hugged him. And Joseph came and hugged them both, and everybody cried. Jesus, seeing and hearing his mother's distress, took her hands and gazed into her eyes. "I am sorry to have caused you so much pain. Look, I am safe and fed and washed and have even slept a little. Thank you for loving me so much and coming to find me. I'd begun to think I may have become another Samuel, left to be brought up in the temple." Before we left, I came back to the temple to say goodbye to some of the friends I had made over the last few days. You see that young man over there sitting with some of the teachers? His name is Philo from Alexandria. He has come this year to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. He asks so many good questions. I really enjoy talking with him, and of course the others also. By the time I had finished saying goodbye, I realized it was too late to catch you up. So, knowing I'd be safe here, and thinking this would be the first place you would come to find me, I stayed here during the day and stayed with Philo and his party at night, and they've been very good to me. I was expecting you yesterday afternoon and was beginning to worry for your safety, or if you really had left me to be another Samuel but had forgotten to tell me. Anyway, here you are. Come with me this time to say goodbye to my friends, and then let's make arrangements to go home." And so we did. And if you want to read more about some of the things that might have happened to Jesus before he was 30 years old, then read The Hidden Years by Neil Boyd, which is my favouriteest book of all time. Not that as a donkey I can read books, but as an author I can allow myself a little license.